The secret to learning a foreign language really isn't a secret. To learn a language well, you need to be immersed in the culture of the language. It really doesn't matter what language you learn. The best way to learn is to get on an airplane, go to the country, and force yourself to learn it. In fact, in the long term, the more uncomfortable you make yourself, the more success you'll have in learning the foreign language. That's because you'll force your brain to adapt to the reality of the language that you're trying to acquire. But, of course, the sad truth is that none of us can really do that. I mean, you can't just uproot your life, move somewhere else, and make it worth from nothing. You need to earn money, right? You're not going to earn money using a language you don't know. You're probably not going to earn money just to study a language, and you're not going to be fully immersed if you're using your native language at work all day. In other words, you need a different solution. Now, you know as well as I do that there are all sorts of language services out there declaring that you can become fluent in a certain amount of time. They're not necessarily fraudulent, though I wouldn't pay any of these people a dime. While it is possible to learn the rudiments of a foreign language quickly, there is a difference between actually knowing the language and just memorizing a ton of phrases. And like so many other complicated things in life, there's a perfectly good German word to describe what we're looking for. That word would be das Sprachgefühl. Sprachgefühl is an instinctive or intuitive grasp of the natural idiom of a language. Thank you to Wiktionary for clearing that up. This is more than just knowing how to order food or whatever in the foreign language. This is more along the lines of knowing how to think using that language, of knowing what is culturally appropriate and inappropriate, and knowing the appropriate way to act. And of course, Sprachgefühl really isn't something that you can fake. It's something that you've either got or you don't have. However, there are some things you can do to create an environment for yourself in which you can achieve this. Well, the first and the most obvious is to talk with a native speaker of the language. Your best bet is almost certainly to find a tutor or a teacher to talk with you. Of course, the problem is that that requires money, and private tutors aren't exactly cheap. Now, you could take a language class, but you might find yourself frustrated by the pace of the curriculum or that you're not learning what you really want to learn. And the thing is that taking a class on language doesn't mean that you'll magically learn how to speak it. In fact, in my experience, language classes at the university or at other places like universities tend to teach you more about how to pass tests than how to actually speak the language fluently. A lot of that extra work has to come from you. Anyway, here are a few tools that I found useful on my own journey. So first of all, you want to be selective about the beginning textbooks that you use. I strongly recommend going for entry-level textbooks that come with audio. You want to listen to native speakers right from the start. Now, the best way to achieve this isn't just to go through a lesson and listen to the dialogue. Instead, take your favorite audio editing program and edit the audio files. You want to create cards for Anki or a similar flashcard program to get through these files constantly. Doing this is really essential to doing well in the early stages of language learning. Now remember that computerized flashcards are not just for individual words. You should be learning phrases and full sentences right from the beginning. Language, after all, is not just about a few scattered words here and there. You need to get a feel for how the different words interact in different contexts. Now, the reason why I keep talking about programs like Anki is because they can serve as a great warehouse for things to review. You see, I learned Korean over a decade ago back at the Foreign Service Institute. I wasn't using these programs back then, however, and as a result, I've had to relearn the same thing multiple times to compensate for forgetting. I wish that I had something like Anki right from the start. I could have saved a lot of time, and I would have found it a lot easier to remember things. Now, the early textbooks will become boring to you after a little while. The intermediate stage of foreign language learning is always the most challenging. You'll find yourself beyond the basic textbook stage, but still a little bit hesitant to engage directly with native speaker audio. However, you really need to start engaging with audio at native levels of speech as soon as you can. I think that a lot of us wind up looking for a happy medium, for a place where we feel safe and comfortable in our language learning, one where we don't need to feel challenged. While you do want to take things at your own pace, I really recommend always trying to push yourself to meet higher challenges. My recommendation at the intermediate level is to start working through complex grammar books like the Routledge series. If you combine this with something like the Hyper TTS Anki add-on, you can fake native level audio for your grammar sentences. In particular, the Microsoft Azure Premium voices do an excellent job of simulating native voices. But you need to remember that it's still AI. You'll find that it makes mistakes or odd decisions from time to time. And so you really need to start using real native audio as a supplement. Now, it's kind of tedious, but one thing I found that works really well is to take audio from television shows or even cartoons or movies and cut it up into Anki cards. Now, when you do this, you really need to be conscious of language registers. If you spend time cutting up sentences from classic French novels, for example, you will expose yourself to a higher, more formal register of speech. However, to truly achieve fluency, you also need to look into lower registers of speech as well. This is a problem that people who study Japanese run into all the time. It's easy to try to learn the language through your favorite anime, and there's nothing wrong with using that approach. However, if you don't balance that register of speech with other registers of speech, your language skills will wind up being severely limited. And it really doesn't matter what language it is. The same rule applies for all languages. If you're learning English as a foreign language, for example, it will be important to learn the more formal language that you see in newspapers. But you will also want to get a feel for the speech patterns of ordinary people as well. Or in other words, you want to get your head out of the grammar books and look at how normal people talk as well. In many cases, things that are technically grammatically correct do not accurately reflect how the language is spoken in real life. And this is something that is not easy to learn. In fact, to a certain extent, you won't be able to really experience the language unless you have multiple opportunities to speak it. This is the most difficult aspect of language acquisition unless you're fortunate enough to have a spouse who speaks the language natively. Now, the nice thing about flashcards and spaced repetition is that you can compensate to an extent for not constantly speaking with a native speaker. Or, in other words, you can do sort of fake linguistic immersion by surrounding yourself daily with tasks that actually do force you to use your target language now and then. But at some point in time, you will need to seek out a native speaker to get the practice that you'll need to move up to a more advanced level. And it all takes time, so be patient with yourself. Oh, and above all else, don't forget to read. The thing is that ordinary day-to-day speech generally does not reflect a higher level of language learning. If you're interested in reading complex and difficult classical literature like I am, you really need to spend some time engaging with that level of written text. And as intimidating as it might be at first, you're not going to learn how to read it until you start reading it. Now, the secret about reading extensively is that it increases your vocabulary and understanding of the language. In other words, there are things that you can learn by reading and writing that you cannot learn through conversation alone. And I would argue that serious reading is absolutely critical to pushing yourself from that intermediate stage to the advanced stage. Anyway, what do you guys think? Have you had experience trying a method like this? Let me know down in the comments.